Everclear is now a Rollup itself, so a Rollup to help Rollups. So
what we've seen is that the projects that have done that have not really lasted. But there's no exit from the system. There's no end game.
I didn't know how you were going to take that.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rollup. Today's video is from Singapore, where I sat down with Arjun Bhuptani of Everclear, formerly known as Connext, to talk about why solver rebalancing is an untapped market in the intent-centric future. We talked about intent-based bridging, the challenges of cross-chain interactions and transactions, and how Everclear came to the idea of building out the clearing layer. We talked about the future of solving for long-tail chains and the opportunities there that we've been harping on, the impact of AI on cross-chain transactions, as well as the new token model, a voting bonding model for Everclear. This was a fun episode, and Arjun is a very well-spoken and deep thinker. I enjoyed this 45-minute conversation. Think you will as well. Let's jump right in after a quick word from some of our awesome partners.
Congrats on Mainnet though, right?
Thank you so much.
Well,
Holy shit, it's
been
crazy.
A while.
It has, yeah. I mean, it's there's always when you start kind of working towards getting this stuff live, there's always, you go from this research period to where things are super exciting because you're constantly discovering new things, and then eventually you get to a point where you're okay, we know how this should work, we know what market we're going after, we know all of these things, and then you have this kind of frustrating period where you're okay, now we have to go build it.
Yeah.
And that's always frustrating because you're suddenly in this place where you're okay, we're kind of in limbo. We can't get any new market signals. We already know everything we know about this thing. We just have to wait, and it's always a stressful experience because you're well, the faster we get there, the more we can the sooner we can ship, and the sooner we can start getting feedback again. But of course, because it's crypto, the faster you get there, the more likely you are to make mistakes.
Right.
Because of that. So there's a bit of a trade-off space around okay, how do we make sure that this is done right, while not ending up in the pitfall that many other projects end up in, which is just taking 2 to 3 years to get anything out the door.
Yeah, I realized I said it's been a while, and I didn't know how you were going to take that.
Yeah, I mean, it has. We first had the ideas that kind of contributed to basically the Everclear design almost a year ago.
Yeah.
November of last year, October of last year. And then the design itself, the kind of key breakthroughs that ended up being the design happened in March.
Yeah.
And so it's been a process. It's been and there's several maybe almost 6 months worth of research before anything else that went into how exactly should this work. And even after that, on an ongoing basis, we've been working really closely with a bunch of data scientists and things like that to model out under what conditions what happens under different conditions in terms of system performance, what kind of pricing should people expect, what kind of latency should people expect, because again you're kind of marketizing liquidity across chains, and the dynamics of that are up to the market, right? Whenever you marketize anything, you can't know very precisely exactly how it's going to behave, but it's cool because then that means it can respond to a bunch of different conditions too.
Yeah, so let's talk about kind of what Mainnet means then. You alluded to marketizing this kind of cross-chain ecosystem that is really expanding now. I mean, I think back when Everclear was Connext, it was maybe a couple L2s, a couple chains, and now it's the amount of solving necessary for long tail chains is just growing exponentially. I think we have a couple hundred rollups now. Everclear is now a rollup itself, so a rollup to help rollups. So what is Mainnet from the tech side, from the problem space, the design space, and what does this mean now that Mainnet is live for this cross-chain ecosystem?
Yeah. So especially if you're kind of a newer person that's tuning into Everclear for the first time, it might help to kind of know a little bit of the context behind the project. So before Everclear, before we kind of rebranded Everclear was called Connext. Connext is a fairly older project in the space, probably one of the oldest projects still surviving at this point. Because we were started in 2017 era, and we'd always had this focus around scalability research and interoperability, basically from there interoperability research, two sides of the same coin. And in 2021, we were very, very lucky to kind of be the first real organization in the space to happen upon this idea of intent-based bridging. And it was just sort of a natural evolution of the work that we were doing in scalability in the past. And it's awesome to see the way that has gotten just picked up throughout the space. It makes sense. There's just inherent limitations to trying to get with the traditional sort of bridging model of trying to get some validator set or some multi-sig or some ZK proof to validate for validated transaction. That costs money. Ultimately, you're paying for security in those cases, right? So if you're doing day-to-day user transactions, you can't afford, most users cannot afford to pay the actual cost of security there. Projects subsidize this because they have to, but most users cannot actually pay this. And so we kind of happened upon this idea of like intents, where within intent, what you're doing is you're not sending arbitrary information across chains. What you're doing is you're doing almost like an atomic swap. You're sort of like, you might, for instance, be a person that is like, that wants to, you have like funds on Arbitrum and you want to get them over to Optimism. And I can be like as a solver, or like effectively like a market maker, or effectively somebody that's just holding funds on Optimism. And as long as you tell me like, hey, I want my $100 on Optimism, and I'm willing to pay like a fee for it, I can just give you like $99.97 or something like that on Optimism instantly. And the nice thing is like you can do this in a totally trustless way, where like you get your funds right away. In the case of things like Across, it's in like seconds, right? Which is incredible user experience. You pay almost no fees, and then your funds that you have deposited in the protocol only get unlocked after I prove that I have actually given you funds on Optimism, which is super cool. So like you have the maximum amount of safety. I take on a bit of risk in that like I need to not risk, but basically I need to know that you've deposited funds, and I take on a bit of risk that like there's no like reorgs or things like that. But that's as a service provider, right? Like as a business, it's sane for me to do that because like I can account for that. The challenge though, and this is very specifically the problem that we ran into with like building our intent-based bridge. It's like I, as the solver, what's happened for me is that I have given you money on Optimism, and I'm receiving your money from whatever chain you came from. Say for instance, it's Arbitrum. See, Arbitrum's like a fine case. What if you were coming from like DGen chain, or if you were coming from some just like totally random L3 that like nobody's ever heard of? Well, now as a solver, as a person that's like trying to actively provide liquidity, my funds have ended up somewhere totally random. So you haven't like gotten rid of bridging. You've moved the onus of bridging from you, the user, over to me, the solver.
Right.
But now I, as the solver, have to deal with it. And what we realized when we were doing this in like 2021, 2022 was we like started scaling out this like intent-based system. We grew to like maybe I think about like 50 solvers, which is pretty awesome at the time, right? We were working with like staking service providers, like funds, a bunch of other people, and it had about $50 million in TVL. So everyone was averaging about $1 million in TVL. What we found when we actually like looked at the data was of the $50 million in TVL, maybe like 2.5 to 5 was actually being used. Everything else was just sitting around because these solvers were like, okay, I either don't know how to rebalance because I don't know how to get my money off this chain because there's no infrastructure there yet. Or like it's just too painful and I don't want to think about it, or it's too expensive, right? It's just like I don't want to have to like bridge back to Ethereum and then bridge from Ethereum back to this chain. Like it's going to cost me more in gas than I've earned in fees. So, and we kept running into this problem. Like we would keep every single time we try to like make intents work, we keep like iterating on different designs, and we kept running into the same problem where the solvers were like, yeah, like I have to actually actively manage this capital. So eventually we kind of realized like, okay, this is actually the problem. Right? This is the real thing that we need to think about. Spent the last like 3 years really thinking about that problem. Now, initially we were kind of building a solution to dogfoot it for our own intent protocol, but something really amazing happened about 1.5 years ago where like everybody started to realize like intents are actually, this is the right way to do like fast, cheap cross-chain interactions. And then Uniswap X, this paper came out, and like once that happened, we just sort of were like, okay, everyone's going to do this, and that's basically what's happened. Like just about every single bridge today is like pivoting into intents. There's like a few exceptions, but generally speaking, most people are realizing this is the optimal mechanism. And then many dexes, like like Uniswap, dex aggregators like 1inch, they are all heading towards intents as well, because they're realizing the future of trading is also going to be cross-chain, right? Of course, it has to be. It just has to be on every chain. And so we kind of saw that there's just this problem that we were facing, and everyone was going to run into the same problem at some point.
Any protocol that wants to run any sort of intent-based interrupt.
Exactly. So that was kind of where the Everclear idea came from. Like about 1 year ago, we were like, okay, we're trying super hard to solve this problem for ourselves. We spent years researching it. If everybody else is going to run into this as well, maybe this is actually the thing we need to be focusing on, because like we can't accelerate intent adoption unless this problem is solved, not just for us but for everybody. Right? And so Everclear is a system. We spent a bunch of time thinking about like how do we solve this problem, and what we realized was like, well, the problem is really it's an economics problem, right? The problem is just like rebalancing inventory is like operationally difficult, but it's also just like too capital intensive. It just costs a lot of money, especially if you're like a smaller solver with like 100K or 200K, right? A user makes a 100K transaction, now you need to rebalance your capital. Like, so you're not really getting a lot of like fees before you have to do that operation. What we kind of realized was like, well, this actually skews everything strongly in favor of really large solvers. This is why today, like, there's this like meme around like, okay, well, Wintermute is basically solving all these things. And that's not exactly true. Like, there's actually more people that are running solvers, there's some indies, things like that, but like the reality is, like, yeah, in the cases where Wintermute is participating, like, they're dominating because they have hundreds of millions of dollars in capital, and they have a team. Their literal business is built on this idea of like inventory management, right? And so how do you compete with that as like an indie solver that's like just a person running some infrastructure and like manually rebalancing using a bridge? You don't. What we realized though was that like if everybody's facing this problem, right? What is the benefit that Wintermute gets from having lots and lots of capital? They basically do this thing called netting, where it's like, I have $100 million on a bunch of different chains. I've like facilitated $10 million of volume from here to here. I can just kind of sit on it and not rebalance it, and then just hope that like at some point in the future, like there's going to be volume going the opposite direction. Because you have so much money, it doesn't really matter that much, right? And what we kind of realized was like, well, this sort of thing happens all the time. Like you have flows going in opposite directions, canceling each other out a lot. And when we like pulled data for this, we realized actually it's like on a 24-hour rolling basis, it's like over 80% of flows just cancel each other out completely. And so then that begs the question of like, why even rebalance, right? Why rebalance all of that money? You could just rebalance 20% instead and it would be fine if you could coordinate between solvers.
Right.
And that is the kind of key idea behind Everclear. Everclear is this like, it's not a bridge. It's kind of like a bridge. You can almost think of it like a bridge, but it's a very, very targeted system that allows for solvers and also market makers, centralized exchanges, basically anybody that is moving large amounts of funds between chains to coordinate with each other to settle the like transfers of funds between chains in a way that is provably optimal, right?
Okay.
And I think something that's really important here to understand is that concept of netting, which is like if I'm sending, like a good example is like Visa, right? So like Visa, when you do card payments, Visa like executes those transactions with like the merchant. So like that's kind of like filling your intent, right?
Yep.
You're like, I want to buy these groceries. Visa fills that intent and lets you buy groceries. And then you're on the hook to pay money later. And what Visa does is they take all of the transactions that happen in a period of time in the world, and they net them against one another. They batch them down. And so what they're doing is they're taking like millions of transactions that are going from like Bank of America to Chase, and then millions of transactions that are going from Chase to Bank of America. They're turning those into like two transactions. One final sum of value that's going from Bank of America to Chase, or I guess really one transaction, right? And then they're giving instructions to both banks to be like, this is how you should update your accounts.
Yeah.
And that is just how actually all financial systems work, and there's a good reason for that, right? It's just so much more efficient to just settle like one transaction rather than millions.
Yeah.
That's kind of where Everclear sits. Now, what we've noticed is as this market has expanded, and as we've started to talk about this, more and more people have just come out of the woodwork being like, yeah, actually, I kind of have this problem. Like, we're trying to deal with like LRTs, for instance, right? A lot of the LRTs are trying to enable the ability to restake from anywhere, but all of the restaking infrastructure lives on Ethereum.
Yep.
So if you're an LRT project, and there's like millions of dollars, sometimes tens of millions of dollars of capital a week that you need to move from L2s to L1. Do you want to put that through the canonical bridge? Ideally not, right? Because like if you put it through the canonical bridge, this is ETH that is like outstanding, that's technically backing your LRT.
Yeah.
But if people start selling your LRT on AMMs or trying to like exit their positions, all of a sudden that ETH is technically still locked up, right? So you can actually just depeg these assets if it's just in the bridge for 7 days.
Yeah.
And so ideally, as an LRT, you're getting a much shorter time, right? You want within a few hours. Ideally, you're going from L2 to L1. But because these are like big or $10 million bridge transactions, there's not really any bridge that can even service that today.
Right.
That is something that is like uniquely solved by Everclear, right? Like with Everclear, like those LRT products can say like, okay, I have $10 million of flow, I need to move it from L2 to L1. And when there are users, intent protocols, or really anybody else that is like moving flow from L1 to L2, those things can cancel each other out, and the LRT protocols can get $10 million out at almost zero cost, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of points, but I think the most pressing one to make and to about is I was on a podcast with Jim from Catalyst, and he basically made the claim that one of the biggest opportunities right now that's still the wild, wild west in on-chain crypto is being a solver for some of these long-tail L2s and L3s where there are more niche markets that aren't really currently being filled up by the Wintermutes, the Ambers of the world. So there's kind of these opportunities to get this APR, and I think he quoted, and I'm not going to quote him, like somewhere above 20 to 40% potentially right now on some routes over the course of a year, annualized, of course, as things mature, that changes, but basically there's this opportunity and no one's really doing it. So I have 20 grand in ETH and USDC. Everclear's on Mainnet, and now I want to go solve using something like Kalani or using some sort of like UX that I can kind of like make this solver. Like, I really just understand, how do I take my money, how do I go solve L3s, L2s, how do I use Everclear, like do I need it to be like super dev focused, how do I become a solver is like a question that I keep getting, and now it's like, how do I become a solver with Everclear to take advantage of this opportunity that is here in these long tail chains?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess first off, let's talk a little bit about long tail chains, because I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff coming out like about long tail chains that I think I'm starting to think about a bunch. So the current paradigm, right, is that there's like, and this has been the paradigm for a little time, is there's like a set of 10 chains that have a lot of TVL that are worthwhile to be on as any sort of like service provider, like as both an exchange, a solver, a market maker, or whatever. And it's sort of the same as like what happened like in 2019, where everyone was like, yeah, there's one chain that everybody wants to be on, that's Ethereum. Like, why would you go anywhere else, right? And we live in this paradigm partly because of this issue where it's like it's hard to just like go and support many different chains, and because there was not a reason to just copy paste more EVM compatible chains or more general purpose chains. I'm personally very bearish on general purpose chains going forward. What's happening now though is that there's a shift in the space. Like big applications, even on the big general purpose chain, like on Arbitrum for instance, right? Like the biggest applications are leaving to create their own chains. Everybody's realizing that verticalizing and owning your own stack is actually like an extremely valuable thing. You have sovereignty, which means like you don't have this like noisy neighbor problem of like, oh, someone else is running like a Ponzi scheme on the chain and all of the RPCs go down. Like that just doesn't happen anymore, which is awesome. You also get to capture sequencer fees, and then you get like 100% control over user experience, which is incredible. Exactly.
I'm learning that like the economic stuff is like is powerful, but it's like the customizability part is becoming like the most powerful, persuasive angle for this idea.
Exactly.
Because there's like this app-specific sequencing stuff that's happening now as well, where it's like you can still be on a general purpose L2 and sequence yourself in like these like local consensus mechanisms and still get the revenue, but it's still be on the L2, which is I'm still kind of battling with. You don't need to go down all of that. That's the ass paradigm. But yes, generally agree. And this is how these long tail chains come about. Long tail meaning like newer, less TVL, less notoriety, less bridge infrastructure, all this stuff.
And look, like for what it's worth, the things you should include in that category will be things like Aave chain, right?
Yeah,
and things like Fractal and like exactly like DYDX, like Uniswap, whenever they launch a chain.
Is exactly like long tail L2.
So like at a certain point, these things are not going to be long tail anymore. They're going to be the things. They're going to be the applications that actually have value, right? It's like Arbitrum 1 will become a long tail chain if all of the major apps leave and go and build their own chains, and that's fine. That's like it is, right? But that's like what Arbitrum ecosystem wants, because
let's launch orbit chains, right?
Exactly, that's the end game for them, right? So like that's I think that's an important change that is happening in the space that I think like we sort of are not doing enough to account for, because everybody's mental model is still like stuck in this old paradigm. And that actually is that's why I actually really like this question of like, how do I solve for long tail chains? I completely agree with Jim. Like I think like there is a decent amount of value that you can get from solving for long tail chains right now. A big part of the reason for that is that a lot of these like longer tail chains, they're like very heavily incentivized to get people to solve for them. They're like pay you to be there.
Jim said just like hit them up.
Exactly. They will literally be like, please like take our money, just like fill transactions to my chain. I need to onboard users, right? But like I think that that's going to grow quite a bit as well. It's not just like, oh, this is like a niche thing where there'll be a small amount of volume and like it's like it'll get overconsumed and tapped out very quickly. It's like we're going to continue seeing this over time. I really strongly believe that like we're going to most applications will just become chains. Then this brings up this question of like, okay, well, how do I then solve for these longer tail ecosystems, right? This is actually one of the things that Everclear really uniquely enables. So like when you're a solver, like say you're an intent protocol, we were an intent protocol, right? The big problem we would always run into when we were expanding new chains was like, okay, there's just like added coordination overhead. Once you get to a new chain, you have to figure out how am I going to provide a good experience to my solvers to be able to rebalance to that chain. That was like the biggest blocker that was stopping us from getting places, right? Like we tried a bunch of different options. We had these like liquidity pools on each chain that we were using to like rebalance solvers, but then that meant we had to go bootstrap liquidity on each chain. We had initially just sort of been like, no, you know what, like we're just gonna let them figure it out, and then we would do that, and then they would get stuck there, and they'd be like, hey, this is a shit experience. They would then stop servicing the chain, then we would have to stop servicing the chain, So like that has always kind of been the blocker, and like you go and you talk to the intent-based protocols today, they are scrambling to figure out ways to be able to expand more quickly by fixing this problem specifically, right? And so with Everclear, the idea was like, okay, let's create this like base like rebalancing liquidity layer. And if you have this base layer that is largely like open, right, and this kind of dovetails into our new kind of token model announcement that we'll talk about in a minute. But if you have this like this base layer that is largely open, ideally eventually completely permissionless, then chains can go and just like press a button on like a Rollup as a service provider or something like that, get Everclear. And then once Everclear is there, it becomes really easy for any intent protocol to just go and deploy. And once an intent protocol is there, you can go and solve, right? How do you run a solver for these ecosystems? Well, like right now, you are bottlenecked by which, it's like if you're solving for a cross, you're bottlenecked by the chains that a cross is on. But if a cross is then able to expand into any ecosystem really quickly, they can make it permissionless too, right? They can just be like, look, anyone can go and deploy a cross. If you're a solver, you can go and deploy a cross yourself to a certain chain if you want to be there. Yeah. And like if Everclear is there too, it's sensible for you to do that.
Yeah. So if I have this capital, I need to run some sort of program or something to be a solver for a cross, or to be a solver for what's the?
You're running like basically infrastructure. You're running like a solver is like a node, right? Like you're sort of exactly. You're sort of running. It's almost like it's actually like in some ways like aside from the capital management piece, it's actually like easier to run than like a staking validator because there's no slashing. Yeah,
but like what we need is a UX to like be able to spin it up, and I think that's what that Kalani team is kind of working on.
Exactly.
Like once we have a solver as a service, like Rollup as a service, and I can just be like connect my wallet with the capital, choose the routes that I want to solve for, and then press go and pay them a little bit of money to like upkeep it.
Yeah.
I mean,
it makes sense.
The amount of usage on Everclear would be massively skyrocketing, and then also the
number
general
of solvers. Yeah, exactly. That whole market
just
just blows wide open. I mean, we actually kind of experimented with this because, again, we were sort of like when we first were going, our bottleneck was liquidity and getting to many chains, right? So we were simultaneously trying to like solve this problem of like rebalancing. In parallel, we were like, okay, let's make solving super easy. And so we kind of did a lot of this where we for like the V1 of Connext, we were like, okay, let's just make it so that's like setting up a Connext router, which is what we called it at the time. It's a solver terminology, it just didn't exist. Setting up a router, we just make it like a push button. Yeah. And like we had this like very simple flow where you just basically like push a button, like set up like a config file, push a button, and then like it would just deploy it, and you would just like put in your key, and it was ready to go. It unfortunately was not that easy because of the rebalancing piece, because of the inventory management. But on testnet, when we did this, we opened it up to like the community, and we were like, hey guys, like look, like incentivized testnet, also like in general, separately from incentivized testnet, just like try running this infrastructure and see if it works for you, right? We had like 600 people run solvers. Yeah. It's insane. That's like 10 times the number of solvers in the entire space, right?
Yeah, it feels like the opportunity is gonna like the APY and the yield is gonna dwindle, but the experience for like I think that's the current paradigm. Like let's get this yield. Let's be the first ones there. But once that kind of gets more mature and evened out, we'll just see more niche routes being filled consistently. And then I think like I'm starting to put the vision together in my head. How if we have a wallet experience that abstracts something like a particle, a Zion, a Goric, Near, any of these wallets, right? These kind of like chain abstracted wallet interfaces or account abstraction interfaces. That with the intent-based interoperability layer underneath, powered in some capacity by Everclear amongst other solvers, is like, boom. Yeah. You can go anywhere, any chain, any app, anywhere.
Any kind of use case.
Very quick, very cheap. Yeah. Without even really like needing to even think about a bridge. Yeah. Because you're just going to the apps and the wallets and it's just moving, and you have so putting the vision together in my head. The question now
it's actually even more like fascinating than that because and I've actually been talking about this a lot here at Token, and I'm probably going to start being on a soapbox about it a lot more. But I think people are really underestimating like what the impact that like AI is going to have on this. Because like when you're typing something in ChatGPT, what is that? That's an intent, right? Yeah, you tell ChatGPT like, hey, help me optimize my portfolio. Right now, I can give you recommendations on how to optimize your portfolio, but you have to go and execute it yourself.
Dude, we're gonna get to a world where you can literally have an agent.
Yeah.
You can be like.
And you're just putting it in ChatGPT. ChatGPT is like, cool. I can optimize. Here is my recommendations. If you agree with these recommendations, I can broadcast this out, and then broadcast it out as an intent, and then other basically AI-based solvers are just like, you want to do these like extremely complex operations that are like swap this asset, bridge it, do this here, then deposit, then take like the like all of the like Y curve, whatever,
Oh, yeah.
right? Like the same kind of like extraordinarily Ponzi-ish, not Ponzi, but extraordinarily like looped.
Like complex
exactly.
stuff. Like multi-step transactions.
Yeah, all of the stuff
sure.
that right now it takes like severe autism to do.
You're like clicking on your ledger, and then
you're
you're like bridging, and then you're switching your network on Rabby, and like
exactly, yeah. So like I think a lot of that is gonna blow that whole like degen space wide open, because it's gonna, it's like right now as a degen you have to be like extremely well versed in all of these primitives to like stack them up in the right way to farm things very optimally, and like an AI model is just gonna be like, yep, I know how to do this, and
just like give you a recommendation.
Yeah.
Based on like
here's the level of risk you'll get, and here's the level of like reward you get.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. So economically speaking, so you guys are going and launching this Arbitrum Orbit chain, and through Gelato is what you guys did. You guys are launched today. Yesterday. And so you guys are using Arbitrum AnyTrust for DA, or have you guys made up your mind on the DA side, or?
Yeah, we basically, so at launch I think it's using a DAC, Data Availability Committee. We're using EigenDA, but we were waiting for the EigenDA Arbitrum Orbit integration to finish. Actually, we just got a message yesterday from them being like, hey, this is now up and running. So
nice.
I think we're going to follow up on that. And it's a fairly simple migration.
Cool. Okay, so you've got now this Rollup this chain, this Optimium, if you will.
Yeah.
Which does not matter, but it kind of does, but it kind of doesn't.
Yeah. We like in our case, we don't need to give the same kind of guarantees that other rollups do. Like
I was
the things that
this.
we need. Oh yeah.
So how do transactions happen on Everclear chain? Like, talk to me about like, okay, so I'm a solver. I'm pushing out. I'm moving my inventory around. Everclear's rebalancing it. How does those transactions settle?
Yeah.
What is the kind of economic model of Everclear as well? What adds the token there?
For sure, yeah. So in a nutshell, like what Everclear is doing is sort of like it's like a computer to figure out the optimal pathway to settle like a bunch of people's flows, right? So like 100 different like market makers, solvers, centralized exchange, whatever. Like they all put their money into the system, and they're like, hey, or put their money into like the kind of contracts that live on any chain, and they're like, I want to get to this chain or this set of chains with like this kind of pricing over this kind of period of time or whatever, right? Effectively, those are also intense. Everything is kind of intense technically. And what the system does is like the Everclear rollup has logic that lives on top of it that is just written as smart contracts. That is just trying to compute based on like a first in first out queue of like when people put stuff into it. It's just computing how do I settle to all these people based on the available capital, and anything that's left over, how do I then incentivize people to go in like arbitrage, right? The idea here, there's a couple of kind of key points there. One is all of this core logic lives as smart contracts in the world. Why? Because then it's verifiable. All of these different actors that are using the system, they're incentivized to collaborate, but they're definitely competitors, right? Like, I don't think like the market makers really like necessarily trust each other. They like know each other and like work together, but they don't trust each other. Right. They're hyper-capitalist financial institutions. It makes sense, right? And so we have to kind of give very strong guarantees that like, okay, every actor in the system is going to be paid out fairly according to the rules of the system.
Right.
And the nice thing is that because these are the rules of the system, the entire system is described as smart contracts on this Arbitrum Orbit rollup. If the system misorders transactions or basically like pays out some people unfairly, that is very easy to prove. Okay. And you can then just do a normal like rollup dispute, right? You can just dispute the rollup policy slash the sequencer. Everybody can exit the rollup using like the Arbitrum like escape hatch mechanism. So that's like a really, really valuable like piece of this.
Yeah.
The other piece of this is like the logic, because this is logic that lives on a rollup that is, it's EVM compatible, of course it's very application specific, but because it's like living on this VM, this logic can also be like changed and iterated on very quickly. And we want to turn it into sort of a more broader marketplace in the long term, where like there's just, solvers can kind of opt into like, hey, I want to use this kind of pricing, I want to use this kind of a model for settlement because I believe that this is the best mechanism for me for this use case.
Yeah. You know how there's been talk about rollups as microservices.
Yeah.
This is like a very clear example.
Exactly.
Of
a verifiable microservice.
Of just a single service-based chain. Like there's only one purpose here. That there's one goal, and you can expand to kind of as you play around and figure things out. But this is like a very clear example of like a blockchain that is meant to help facilitate other blockchain interaction, but it's just for one thing.
Yeah.
So how does the token come in? You guys just released an interesting model, I think. Well, actually, you know what? First, you're a very ideological guy. You're not like in the space to get rich quick. you're definitely not like a fan of centralization. And I think this is like come back to like maybe like come back to like bite you a bit, or like maybe you haven't been as like greedy or haven't been as like cutthroat as you needed to be at times as a founder. I don't mean to just to throw you on the spot here, but like, so how are you thinking about kind of taking care of the token, taking care of your community, and like, you know, making sure that the system all kind of economically flows together? And then if you have any like philosophical takes on like being a founder in the space and not like being a bit of a shithead, then I'd love to hear that too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at this point it's like indisputable that like I am not really that motivated by money, because like, you know, over the course of being in this space for almost like 10 years, there were so many other things that I could have done, like so many ways in which like I personally could have like, you know, enriched myself. And I think there's like a category of other people from that period that are like that too, who are just like, yeah, like ultimately, what was the point of this whole space, right? Like I'm not really in this to like build finance 2.0. I'm in this to like build, like I joined this space because I want to try to find ways to build infrastructure that lets people resist authoritarian governments and like reduce power of like large scale centralized Web2 tech companies, right? Like I still really truly believe in that. Like ultimately I don't, like, getting rich is fun, but I think it's like more interesting to do these other things. But at the same time, I think that it's obviously really important to like to build systems and build organizations that have like positive financial outcomes for its participants, and it's like right, because that's part of what makes these systems work, right? Like we need to create systems of incentives that actually like help propel this stuff forward and have it be sustainable. I think for us, like, you know, part of the reason why it's sort of like taken a long time to get here is because we've been focused on building things the right way. And I think that that's something that, you know, it's a hard call as a founder, especially in this space, right? Like you can, you know, there's certainly a lot of ways to kind of take shortcuts in this space to be able to make money. Generally, what we've seen is that the projects that have done that have not really lasted.
Yeah.
And so this like whole space is littered with the corpses of like, you know, like the kind of the graph that looks like this and then immediately like that. And then in all of those cases, right, those people, like, it's like the founders make money. Sometimes the founders make money, the investors make money, and like, but that's it. And that's not great. You know, that's a symptom of the exact kind of broken system that that exists in TradFi that we're aiming to fix.
So how are you gonna do this?
Yeah. For me, I think like a big part of our philosophy with Connext and now Everclear was always like, we want to build this system for the long term, right? We're building foundational infrastructure for the internet. The internet isn't something that just like appeared overnight. It didn't take like, you know, 4 years to scale to being a multi-billion-dollar company. It was like something that took like decades to build, and that has been our philosophy. It's like let's figure out, like, obviously we want to be successful. Obviously we want this project to be successful. We want token holders to be in a position where they feel happy that they like align with the project and they like believe in it. But at the same time, our philosophy has always been like, look, like we're not building for 6 months from now. We're building for like 10, 15, 20 years from now. And how do you take the right set of decisions to make sure you still survive to that point? I think like, you know, token stuff is always interesting. Like there's, you know, there's this like interesting trade-off space where like we know that tokens are a really awesome way to be able to drive financial incentives for public goods. But they're also, like, we don't have the best models yet to figure out how to do that. And so a lot of it is just experimentation, right? And with token experimentation, it's like especially difficult because the right kinds of token models can like carry you and lead to a hugely successful outcome for the project. But the wrong kind of token model can like either lead to just implosion of the project or can lead to just malicious activity, right? It can lead to,
right
exactly, And so for us, I think a big part of a lot of this was just like really taking the time to think through like, okay, how should this work? Let's be like conservative. Let's make sure that we understand very deeply how this space like, make sure we understand very deeply like what problem we're solving and like how the token model can dovetail into that and not just shoehorn something in because we want to like pump a price, right? And I think like the other big part of it was that we also sort of felt strongly that this sort of has to be like a collaborative effort. Like it needs to come from a coalition of organizations within our community that are aligned on this idea of like, let's find ways to create an optimal outcome for like all of the different stakeholders and not just for like one entity or one set of token holders.
Understood.
That's something that this is the reason why I'm super excited by like the like token model announcement and things like that. So for context, basically this may have kind of gotten missed in the announcement because of course Mainnet announcement is like the big piece of news, but as part of this, the DAO basically voted for a new token model called vote bonding. It's an entirely novel mechanism. That sort of, maybe not entirely, no, it's a novel mechanism that acts as like an evolution to like vote escrowing. This model was proposed by an organization called Vending Machine. They're fantastic. Definitely check them out if you haven't already. They basically like worked really closely with the Everclear Foundation and a bunch of other people in the ecosystem to figure out, what are the different levers that are going to be important as part of Everclear to grow. And in particular, how can we solve some of the secondary problems for solvers that are not necessarily, just this like core issue of rebalancing? Because like what we realized was like, okay, well, you can help solvers rebalance inventory, but to your point, right? Like, if you're a solver and you want to go to a long tail chain, you want to start solving for long tail chains. How do you know which long tail chains are the ones that are worthwhile to hold liquidity on, right? How do you kind of get over that initial bootstrapping problem of like, I have some capital and I want to go work with this brand new chain, but because it's a brand new chain, there's no users there, there's no volume there, but at the same time, there's not a way to get users there without an intent-based person, right? So you have this like, exactly, it's a little bit of a crazy situation. And so these chains are obviously like willing to give incentives, they're willing to kind of like help subsidize that, but that is also up to a point, right? They want it to be a sustainable system, they don't want to end up in a world where they're just paying tokens forever. And so we kind of like looked at the market and noticed that this is a similar, very, very similar problem to like what happens when you kind of initially launch a token, where there's like you need to bootstrap liquidity for a token on a DEX, but there's no incentive to bootstrap that liquidity until there's enough fees coming from being generated from the DEX in order to actually like have people leave capital there, right? And what we noticed was like there has been obviously over the course of the last few years this like focus on like vote escrowing, which was initially proposed by Curve. And then has like had several iteration evolutions to get to some stuff like Velodrome and Aerodrome today. Yeah. And the really cool thing about that token model is it's a really effective like B2B token model, right? It's like it's a way to basically like almost like have organizations like companies or I guess like token issuing projects be like B2B businesses that the DEX is sort of like selling to. And those organizations are like that like provide an initial set of incentives, but then those incentives taper off, and that over time like bootstraps, like protocol, not necessarily protocol load, but basically bootstrap liquidity for the protocol token against like main assets. There's something really powerful there. That's sort of the same kind of core problem we want to solve, but we realize that there's limitations as well. So Vending Machine had sort of done this really awesome analysis on like vote escrowing, and they kind of like pointed out all of these challenges that exist with the model today. One of the big ones being that like vote escrowing today is like a fairly like inflationary thing, right? Yes. It's like a basically up only supply model where you're like locked into this forever game where the actors in the system you're sort of always incentivized to continue going and like locking your tokens. And you're incentivized to do this because if you don't lock your tokens, eventually the supply is going to grow to the point where you just have nothing, right? And so it creates this like, it's like a all successful assets are Ponzi's in some way, right? Like US dollar is a Ponzi for that reason, and I think I think like the Ponzi aspect of this is that everybody's sort of like playing this game to race to like continue to lock more and more to get more and more ownership, but there's no exit from the system.
There's no end game, yeah.
There's no end game, and this is like one of the big challenges that you're sort of seeing with a lot of like vote escrow systems today is that like locking rates are dropping because people are like, well, what happens? Like, I lock up for 4 years, but then what? Like, how do I actually get anything out of this? How do I get out of the system? Yeah. And then similarly, like if it's just inflating forever, like when does that end, right? It's a good way to bootstrap liquidity and get going, but like at what point does the system sort of become self-sustaining and no longer need like continuous incentivization to work? So those are the problems that we thought about a lot, and like Vending Machine had these really awesome ideas about ways to mitigate, where we discussed a lot of things around like, one big thing was around like giving people those exits from locks, like allowing them to like exit the system like early, at a discount, right? Basically penalizing people for exiting their locks early, but allowing them to have that exit such that they have the safety of knowing, okay, I'm okay locking up my tokens to be able to earn like a revenue share and things like that, but I don't necessarily I'm not necessarily locked into that forever. If I want to exit, I can do that. And what's interesting is that's kind of already happening in cases like Velo and Euro, where like those tokens are being sold. They're just being sold in like a private OTC market and not in like, the public. Yeah. And so like you're just kind of protocolizing that thing that's already happening, which is kind of cool. The other thing that we spent a lot of time thinking about was like supply, and ideally kind of what something that I was personally really interested in was like, I think like the best kinds of economic systems are ones where you don't just have this like, you know, one runaway mechanism of like, okay, we're just going to inflate this thing forever, like the US dollar, for instance. You know, there's like, I like models like ETH where, okay, like the way that ETH works is fascinating, right? ETH supply increases and decreases to keep up with the market structure. So like as, if during times of like lack of usage, the supply will inflate in order to incentivize additional security, so that Ethereum as a blockchain becomes more robust and becomes more attractive for developers to build on top of. But at times of surplus, where there's like a lot more fees being generated, extra fees are burned, and so that you're just burning ETH, so you're decreasing the supply. And this is great because this means that like you are creating more space to inflate later if you need to, and also it's great because it incentivizes people to sort of be more aligned with the protocol. Incentivizes holding the asset, which is really cool in ETH's case, and it also like it just also kind of like changes the economics. You're just taking, instead of having this like surplus capital flow into miners' pockets or validators' pockets, which was kind of what was happening with ETH earlier, where like validators are just earning ludicrous amounts of money, and it was like okay, like it's great for the validators, but like is it really good for the ecosystem that happens? Instead, you have this like more sustainable outcome. And so the vote bonded token mechanism works kind of similarly, where because we have these like unique dynamics that come from the fact that like, you know, like Everclear is not like a pool-based mechanism. There's no like passive liquidity. All of it is like active liquidity. There's not an easy way to kind of just like have people dump tons and tons and tons of capital in there, or like you've kind of like people have been able to like capture governance in the way that, you know, Aura and other folks have been able to. And at the same time, because there isn't going to be that kind of an outcome, revenue that is generated, there is a possibility to have surplus revenue. And surplus revenue is used to basically repurchase VBNext, repurchase space, like de-supply next to the market, to create additional tokens that can then be used for future inflation, right? Future emissions. And so you ideally like should have a supply curve, have a system that looks more like Ethereum, where like during periods where we need market expansion, we want to like grow to many chains. We like Everclear wants to like support many ecosystems, and there are solvers that want to go and support more ecosystems. You might have like inflation because you're incentivizing these solvers to go to these ecosystems and hold liquidity there. But once they're there and they start generating revenue because people are starting to use the system, use the solvers, surplus fees that are generated from rebalancing these solvers flow back into the system and are used to decrease the supply. And so during periods of high usage, you should actually see reductions in supply of Next. I think that's like honestly that was like when they proposed this, it was awesome. Like it was incredible. It was like, this is such an incredibly sick token model, because it's like I like models like this that are kind of like elastic and change under different conditions, that actually react to the market rather than being like, this is what we're gonna do and you're gonna just do this until the project dies, basically. Yeah.
My only last question on this model is like, I don't know how you guys are thinking about the revenue generated from like sequencing transactions and being like a Rollup operator, and how that's going to come into the system.
Yeah, that's a good question. So like there aren't going to be, at least in the initial phases, there's not going to be a ton of like revenue generated sequencing.
I can imagine so.
Yeah, so the reason for that is that like the system is basically hosting a bunch of core logic, but that logic is not being like paid for by users, right? It's like the system itself is just like operating that logic in cycles. Like every epoch, there's like, we have like gelato bots that are just doing this. So so the revenue that would be generated would actually be fees that we're paying. So we're basically just sort of paying it for our own sequencer.
Okay.
So that, yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's like there's no sequencer fees right now. Now in the long term, there's an argument to be made that you can actually like build more interesting things on top of this, and that's something that we've been thinking about a lot. Is like, you know, like you have any instance where you have like value that is locked for a period of time. So like think of like invoicing in like supply chain, right? Like when you have value that is locked for a period of time, that's an asset, right? That's like it represents a commitment to receiving some money in the future. You can financialize that, and I think that there's like a really interesting like class of DeFi applications that could be built on top of this that we are starting to think about, and I think in the longer term would be something that would be interesting to create. And
which can make more sequencer revenue.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah, that token model sounds really interesting. I'm excited to kind of participate, see it in the wild, and also just see this go live. It's gonna, like, I'm not gonna be able to feel it at first, but as the ecosystem grows and as kind of more solvers can come online, as the chain abstraction projects can come out and just kind of build up this stack, we're gonna feel it in the user experience in the future, which I'm excited for. So thanks for coming out. Congrats on Mainnet, and
thank you so much.
We have a fireside chat now.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, cheers.